It's my pleasure to welcome you back to another interesting episode of Space and Style. It's a real estate show designed to cater to all your real estate needs. My name is Olamide Onifade, and thank you for sharing your time with us today. Again, last week on the show, we had a very interesting topic where we discussed the importance of tenancy agreements, and I trust you learned one or two things from it. Today, we are going to discuss the rights and duties of tenants. Of course, where there are rights, there is a corresponding duty attached. And we still have our guest from the previous week to do justice to this topic. We also have other segments on the show to provide you with trends and tips to put you on the top of your game in all your real estate transactions. But before we jump into the conversation, we have to go on a short break, and we'll be back in a minute. Thank you for staying with us. Before the break, we were talking about the rights and duties of tenants, and to discuss this topic with me is our guest from the previous week, Mr. Roland Dogoh. He is a lawyer who obtained his LLB degree from Ambrose Ali University, Ekpoma, and he also attended the Nigerian Law School, where he bagged the second-class upper division. We also attended the University of Lagos and also backed an LLM degree. He has been in active legal practice since his call to the Nigerian bar. Thank you so much for coming again.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Last week was really interesting. We talked about tenancy agreements and all that. And of course, to every tenancy agreement, there has to be tenants and landlords. So we'd like to take the rights of the tenant first.
Okay.
This week. So, what are the rights of tenants? Because I understand that there are rights and there are duties.
Essentially.
So to even start the conversation, let's start with what are the rights of tenants?
Okay. There are some basic and fundamental rights that would usually inure to the tenant upon the execution of the tenancy agreement. First of them, which is very important and basic, is the right to quiet and peaceable enjoyment of the demised premises. In a layman's language, this connotes that the tenant, upon the execution of the tenancy agreement, has a right to the enjoyment of the premises that
exclusive possession.
Exclusive possession is a fallout of this particular right. This connotes that the tenant should have exclusive use of the place to the exclusion of every other person, inclusive of the landlord. So the landlord should not in any manner whatsoever or in any way whatsoever interfere with the right of peaceable enjoyment of the tenant. Another fallout of this right is the right is the right to privacy, which is a draw-out or a follow-up of the right to the exclusive possession. It is expected that throughout the duration of the term that has been granted to the tenant, that the tenant would have privacy and free from all forms of disturbances and interferences whatsoever from the landlord or any person claiming through the
Roland,
landlord.
let me cut you here.
Okay.
Well, of course, this is Lagos, particularly in Lagos.
Yes, please.
Your landlord might be living inside the same compound or probably living next. Yes. How is that obtainable?
Well, it is very, very obtainable. That is why a tenancy agreement is very, very important. Once the agreement is there, the implication is that that premises, which would have been adequately described in the tenancy agreement, would be exclusively for the tenant. Once there is an interference, the implication is that that right has been breached. So the fact that the landlord lives with the tenant in the same premises does not give the landlord that right to interfere or disturb the
Can you give
right
us instances of interference?
It is expected that for the term granted, the tenant who is in possession would enjoy quiet possession. This presupposes that the landlord, without notice, cannot just barge into the premises, and for whatever reason, the reason may be justified, the reason may be tenable, but it is expected that some form of notice would have been extended to the tenant before visiting the premises. For example, where for any reason there is a repair that is to be effected, it is expected and it is only reasonable that the landlord will give notice, adequate notice to the tenant that on so day at so time I will be around to either inspect the premises or for the purpose of carrying out a particular repair. So once there is no notice and the landlord shows up, that would mean some form of interference. And the tenant, to some extent, has reasonable right to protect his exclusive possession and his privacy.
And how does he do that?
Well, if there is a knock on the door, for example, and the tenant has guests in his apartment, and it's at that point that the landlord decides to come and do an inspection of the accommodation, I think the tenant can politely tell the landlord that it is not convenient, where such notice was not previously communicated to the tenant.
Sorry to put you in. Something just came to my mind again.
Okay.
It's very usual. It's a practice in, amongst landlords to tell you that, take for instance, you rented a flat, a 3-bedroom flat.
Yes, please.
They still come around to ask to tell you the number of people that can occupy. Is that within the law?
Well, if parties from the beginning agreed that a certain number of persons should be restricted to the use of the accommodation, then to some extent the landlord may be able to come and inquire or try to enforce those
even
provisions
if he's not paying the
of
utility
the agreement.
bills.
Well, it is immaterial. Where in most instances the landlord would ask, how many of you, what's the number of your family, you understand? And
they will tell you can't take guests.
Where from the beginning parties agree that a certain number of persons will be the persons that will be living in the accommodation, I think the landlord, to that extent, can seek to protect that provision of the agreement. But where it is not provided for, it is expected that a tenant, for example, would have guests, would have visitors from time to time. I think to that extent, the landlord cannot now come to now seek to enforce that provision where those guests are just visiting, where those visitors are just coming around for a couple of days and it is expected they will go back. So the landlord cannot now come and use that as a ground for seeking to disturb or interfere with the rights of the tenant.
So, moving forward quickly, what about the issue of rent increase? Because, excuse me, if you look at the tenancy law of 2011, yes, I don't think there's anything that caters to indiscriminate increase in rents. So it's at the discretion of the landlord and the tenant. So what protection does the tenant have when you just wake up, or probably after a year or two, though you've paid a particular rent, your landlord just doubles it? What is the protection for a tenant?
Well, the issue of rent increase is a matter of a negotiation. Just like every contract, parties are expected to be at the same point on the issue of rent. Where the tenant has moved into the premises and after a period of time, the landlord decides to exercise his option of rent review, I think usually parties are expected to agree, but that is not the position in reality. You find a situation where the landlord or the landlord's lawyer would write to the tenant informing the tenant of increase of rent from XYZ to a particular amount. What is expected in such a situation is for the tenant to open a line of communication. Whether you like it or not, the landlord has a right
To
to
increase his rent.
review his rent. So the reasonable thing that is expected of the tenant in such a situation is to open a communication line with the landlord and seek to discuss the review, so that the increment will not be so much that the tenant, as it were, would not be in a difficult or bad situation.
Thank you so much. We're due for a short break. Just
Okay.
hold your thoughts. We'll be back shortly. Welcome back, everybody, and thank you so much for staying glued to your screens and you're still watching Space and Style. So before we went on the break, we were talking about rent.
Yes, please.
Prevailing economic situation, does it have an impact on this?
Definitely. The landlord is not living in an isolated world. Definitely, economic indices and all of that would usually affect the issue of rent. Inflation is a common factor and is usually a common ground that a landlord give for rent review. And basically, like I mentioned earlier, the option to review rent when taking alongside prevailing economic circumstances, the landlord usually has an obligation to some extent to discuss the review with the tenant. And in situations where the notice of rent increments is given adequately, the tenant will have the option of either still choosing to remain on the property upon the expiration of his tenancy, or by paying the new rent, of course, or vacate same, where he or she is unable to pay the new rent. So the issue of adequate notice is very, very important.
Okay, so moving on to this question. Who is responsible for maintenance and repairs?
Well, the issue of responsibility on maintenance and repair would usually depend on the type or nature of the repair that is to be effected. Where the maintenance or the repair is of a major magnitude, it is expected that the landlord would be responsible. Issues of roofing, for example, that is so important. Issues of the structure of the property in question, then it is expected that the landlord would be responsible. However, for other repairs and maintenances that are of minor nature, for example, issue of wear and tear, it is expected that as facilities and amenities are being used over time, they will begin to deteriorate. Broken tap, broken security lights, and all of that. It is expected that the tenant would effect those
But what
repairs.
happens in a case I send notification to my landlord that it doesn't come on time to repair, and especially when the repair is very, very urgent? What should a tenant do in that instance?
Well, in such an instance, in as much as a notice has been given to the landlord to draw his attention to a particular defect that need urgent maintenance or urgent repair, as it were, it is expected that after a reasonable time, the tenant, in order to protect himself, particularly from the harshness of the weather and all of that, where, for example, there is a thunderstorm which has affected the roof of a building, and then the tenant is able to put the landlord on notice, and the landlord fails or neglect to effect such repairs as soon as possible, the tenant can go ahead and effect such repairs. Then he will now need to seek some form of a compensation or reimbursement from the landlord, because the obligation to effect those repairs is primarily that of the landlord.
Okay, what about the issue of service charge?
Yes.
Because the law says in every 6 months, you're supposed to get a written account when you pay service charge. What do you think of this?
Well, the issue of service charge, it's a different contract entirely, because apart from the tenancy agreement, you find instances where the landlord and the tenant will also go into another agreement for the provision of certain services for the tenant in the premises that is rented. The law has also given some form of protection so that the tenant is protected from abuse by the landlord. That is where the issue of accountability comes in. The landlord is expected to be transparent and open on the issue of service charge. To that extent, the tenant is entitled to periodic account of how the service charge is put to use. This also protects the landlord such that where economic reality is no longer possible for a particular amount that was being charged as service charge.
Like now that diesel has gone up.
Right, so the landlord too, if he's transparent and open the tenant, he can also tell the tenant, this is the reality on ground. The XYZ amount that you were paying previously is no longer enough to take care of this particular service, and there is the need to review what was being paid. So it's both ways. When parties are open and transparent, it helps the relationship.
We have a lot of issues concerning the rights of tenants, but of course, we have obligations.
Yes.
But because of time, can you just quickly wrap up on what the law expects the tenant to do in correspondence?
Well, then there are certain obligations that are expected of the tenant, like we have mentioned earlier. There is the duty of rent. The tenant is expected to pay rent. Rent is a fundamental term of the contract. So the rent is expected to be paid by the tenant in the manner and on the basis that parties have agreed to. Then another duty is the duty to maintain and keep the premises in a tenantable state. It is expected that due to wear and tear, that as the tenant occupies the premises, that certain facilities will need repair. So there is an obligation on the tenant to ensure that those facilities are maintained, they are repaired, so that the property will continue to be in a state that will be habitable to the tenant. Then another duty that is expected of the tenant is the duty not to alter any part of the premises or the building without the consent of the landlord. We have instances where tenants on their own will begin to build extensions, build additions, begin to alter the premises or the accommodation without even putting the landlord on notice. That would amount to a fundamental breach of the tenancy agreement. So
in that case, what are you supposed to do? You want to have an extension.
It's expected that you put the landlord on notice to seek his consent. It is not bad to make improvements on a property or a premises, but it is only reasonable that before you begin to build extensions, before you begin to build improvements and additions, put your landlord on notice. That is the reasonable thing to do.
And lastly, I would like to, just bring this also to your attention.
Yes, please.
The honesty of the intention of purpose.
Yes.
Some people get a property which is strictly residential, and before you know it, they convert it to a church.
Yes.
They convert it to a business, commercial purpose. This is a fundamental breach.
Yes.
What do you think about that?
Usually the terms of the tenancy agreement would usually determine the use that the property is to be put to. Where a property is given out to a tenant for residential purpose only, and the tenant decides to use the property for commercial purpose, that obviously is a fundamental breach of the agreement between parties.
And can that lead to an eviction?
The landlord can, on the basis of that, seek to recover possession from the tenant. So in that instance, what the landlord will do is to write to the tenant, informing him or her of his breach of the tenancy agreement, and depending on the terms and conditions of the tenancy agreement, he will not take steps to recover possession from the tenant.
Because of time, I think this is all we can take. But of course, this is an ongoing discussion,
Yes.
and we hope you'll come back again.
Well, it will be my pleasure to do so.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for staying with us. We have come to the end of this segment, and I hope you enjoyed yourself, and I hope you learned one or two things from the segment. So we also have the next segment, which is the design tip of the week. Please enjoy it and incorporate it into your DIY.
I'm Dr. Morenike Basharu, CEO and Chief Creative Director at Dewey Options Limited, an interior design firm. So today we're going to talk about lighting in interior design. Lighting is one of the most important elements of design. And it's simply because an interior project is brought to light with lighting. Imagine a space that you do a beautiful colors, beautiful furniture with no light. You know, it's not going to be lively. It will be drab. So lighting brings life to every design project. So we're going to talk about, today I'm going to talk to you about the importance of lighting, and also I'm going to talk to you about the different types of lighting we've got in interior design. So light creates depth and it creates coziness in a design project. Also, light can be used to focus on very attractive areas in a design project because, let me take for example, you design a living space and you put a particular beautiful furniture in a corner, you know, and you want to highlight this furniture, you can put a lighting around there, you know, to bring focus to that furniture. So you use lighting to do that. Also, lighting can be used for tasks. Right? So we want to read, for example, we can have the reading lamps, we can have lighting that are used in kitchen cabinetry, for instance, that you want to focus on some items that you put in your cabinets, right? Or you put wall arts on the wall, you might want to have lighting on top of this wall arts, you know, to focus on some interior accessories that you put on them. So lighting can be used for this. So we're going to go into types of lighting that we have. So we've got three broad category of lighting. So we've got the ambience lighting, we have the task, and we have the accent light. So for the ambience light is like the light that gives the ambience to the space. So it's the bright lighting. So you can use chandeliers to create that. You can use your spotlight to create that. So that's what gives the mood to that space. So let me take, for example, in a workspace, like an office, a corporate office, you want to have bright lighting. So you don't want to start using like the mood yellow or very amber lighting. You want to use the white lighting because that is the function of that space. In a home, for example, maybe you have a living room or you want to have a place where it's cozy, you might want to use like your amber lighting. So we have got the ambient light. We have the task light that is used for purpose. So let me take, for example, in the kitchen, I want to put it under my cabinetry. So if I want to work on the kitchen top, I can put it on and I can chop and see clearly. If I want to read by maybe a reading table in a corner, I want to put light there so it helps me, it illuminates the area properly for me. You know, so we also have the accent light that can focus on pieces, you know, just to accentuate those pieces. So let me take, for example, a wall art. You can have a beautiful wall art on the wall and you want to put a beautiful lighting over it to focus on the wall art. You can have like a pretty piece somewhere, you want to put light on it to just focus on it. So those are the different categories of lighting that we have. But and we also have the decorative lighting. And in some instances, you can have some lighting that are ambience lighting, but again, they're decorative. And that's when we talk about our chandeliers. And that's why we have some chandeliers, they're not drab, they're a bit dramatic, you know, to bring, you know, to pop the space. All right, so let me give you a tip to go away with today. So if you have a small space and you don't want to spend too much and you still want your space to be a bit dramatic, you can just change your chandelier. Have that dramatic chandelier in place. I hope you've been able to learn one or two things today. See you again next week. Bye-bye.
Space and style. wà ní ẹnu iṣẹ́ yẹn sí ọgbọ̀n ọdún. Ó wà fẹ́ ti wà torí situation iṣẹ́ wa yẹn sì bí dọ́là yẹn ṣe ń rise ni owó orin yẹn náà wọ́n máa ń gbé owó ẹ̀ sókè. So whatever ń sìn assuming irin tá a rà ní bí 1,000 tí dọ́là bá rise wọ́n lè ta fún wa 3,000. So àwọn tó dẹ̀ ń gbéjẹ́ fún wa náà ọ̀n ní fẹ́ fowó kù ṣùgbọ́n míì kan ti mọ̀ wá pẹ̀lú iṣẹ́ yẹn kò sí nǹkan tá a lè ṣe ju pé káwa náà tẹ́ wọn lọ́rùn. Challenges pọ̀ gan-an nídìí iṣẹ́ yìí. Ìgbà míì wà tó yẹ pé iná máa disturb wa a ní rí iná ṣiṣẹ́. Generator tá a dẹ̀ ń lò kò powerful bí iná ó ti yé yín. So àwọn challenges tá a máa ń face tá a máa ń dojú kọ lórí iṣẹ́ nìyẹn. So táwọn oníṣẹ́ bá dẹ̀ lọ́wọ́ fẹ́ gbéṣẹ́ kò dẹ̀ sí nǹkan tá a lè ṣe ju pé ká wá miss láti fi parí iṣẹ́ yẹn. Iná generator náà la lè lò. Àsúnmì tó gbé mi ṣe wà yìí máa ń ní program fún iṣẹ́ mi. So mo lè níṣẹ́ 3 4. So àwọn ọmọ tó ń bá mi iṣẹ́ wà tó yẹ pé tí bá ti níṣẹ́ tó pọ̀ bẹ́ẹ̀ màá pọ̀ pé wọ́n wá àjọ handle iṣẹ́ yẹn. So lórí iṣẹ́ yìí náà àwọn ọmọ wà tó yẹ pé àti kọ́ iṣẹ́ tó yẹ pé èmi wà nù wọn tó yẹ pé ó ń lọ school ó ń ti school tó bá close in school á wá síbi á wá kọ́ṣẹ́ yẹn. So ó fi ń ṣe part time. So along the line ó dẹ̀ náà ti wà láyà rẹ̀. Client wà tó yẹ pé èmi wà ó lè lóun fẹ́ gba iṣẹ́ òun níbi ọ̀sẹ̀ kan tíṣẹ́ mi dẹ̀ ti wà lọ́wọ́ mi. So mo lè fún grace fún ọ̀sẹ̀ 2 tó bá lè afford ẹ̀. So I go ahead. So èmi ìtàn dẹ̀ ti mọ iṣẹ́ wa so kò ní doubt and okay kò sí problem wọn á ṣe. So láti bẹ̀ lọ iṣẹ́ ẹ̀gbọ́n lè má tó time tèmi wá dá fún yẹn á gbé àwọn irin tá à ń lò àwọn irin quality. So àwọn nǹkan tá a dẹ̀ fi ń ṣe ó máa ń last débi pé ẹlòmíì gan tó máa padà fún yàn ni. Ìyàtọ̀ tó wà nínú foreign àti local nìyẹn. Foreign bóyá wà ẹ́ kò ń strong ṣùgbọ́n wọ́n máa ń wo finishing tiwa dẹ̀rẹ̀ finishing tiwa ó lè farapẹ́ díẹ̀ ni ṣùgbọ́n tiwa ó máa ń strong ju ti wọn lọ. Ìyàtọ̀ tó wà nínú finishing foreign ni pé material tiwa tó ń mòdì kíní yẹn fún wọn lọ́hùn tiwa ń bí ọwọ́ làwa fi ń ṣe. Irú ìsìn ìgbà táwa fi kọ́ṣẹ́ tiwa ń gbà yẹn àwa lo 6 years a tún fi 6 years sin ọ̀gá ṣùgbọ́n ń sìn láyé òde ni àwọn ọmọ tó ń kọ́ṣẹ́ ń sìn grace wọn ò ju 1.5 years 2 years. So àwọn náà ti wà wọ́n ti gbàyàn dá àwọn náà ti máa dáṣẹ́ ara wọn ṣe. Nígbà tí mo bẹ̀rẹ̀ iṣẹ́ yìí gbà yẹn mo wà ní bí 19 years mo fi bẹ̀rẹ̀ iṣẹ́ yìí nígbà yẹn. So ẹ̀kọ́ rí méjì mo kọ̀ rí lórí iṣẹ́ yìí ni pé ìgbà yẹn náà mo fẹ́ kọ́ ṣùgbọ́n àwọn òbí tó bí mi wọ́n ti ríran jù mí lọ. So àwọn ní iṣẹ́ yìí ló máa kọ́ along the line bọ́ọ̀lù ohun mi kì í gbá ṣùgbọ́n mi ò fẹ́ tàpá sí òfin àwọn òbí mi ni mo ṣe ìyànṣẹ́ ìláyò. Ìgbà tèmi náà dẹ̀ wá wọnú ẹ̀ mo á rí pé iṣẹ́ tó rọrùn ni. Ṣe rí iṣẹ́ wẹ́dà ọ̀pá àti obìnrin ṣe ráwa ọkùnrin wa gan ládé ní ayé ìsìn ọ̀n fẹ́ kọ́ṣẹ́ wẹ́dà torí iṣẹ́ tó le ni iṣẹ́ ojú ni ó ti yé yín nǹkan tó máa fi ń sá fúnṣẹ́ yẹn nìyẹn.
Space and style.
We have come to the end of the show this week, and I hope you enjoyed all the segments. I am still Olamide Onifade, and thank you so much for watching. Until next time, this is Space and Style.